Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Arab Digest podcast. I'm William Law, and my guest today is Sanam Vakil. Sanam is Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at London's Chatham House. Sanam, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill.
Well, Iran, the situation there, it appears that thousands have been killed, many more thousands arrested, and with threats of execution hanging over some of those in prison. It does now seem that the regime has once again crushed a popular revolt. I wonder if that's how you see it, Sanam. And I ask the question because there are those who argue that this was not a spontaneous protest movement, but rather a campaign orchestrated by outside influences, and they point the finger at Israel and the US, that effectively hijacked legitimate grievances of the Iranian people, encouraged people into the streets in an attempt to end the Ayatollah's rule. What do you think?
Well, for me, Bill, that sounds very much like a Islamic Republic narrative. Um, since the protests broke out, as they began to build momentum, moving from being economic strikes into very clearly political anti-Islamic government protests, the establishment, including Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, very clearly began to blame outsiders, blame the United States, Israel, outside opposition groups, instead of trying something new and reflecting and taking a bit of responsibility. So, by pushing the blame outside, which again, let me reassert, is a classic Islamic Republic strategy. They've tried to deflect and, of course, not accept responsibility for what has been the most brutal and repressive crackdown against Iranians in the protests that lasted over 2 weeks and saw from January 8th onwards the Islamic Republic kill and harass and intimidate and arrest their own citizens in an unprecedented way.
Was this protest, because there have been many, many protests, and they've all been put down, as you say, in very brutal and repressive fashion. Was there something different about this protest, do you think, Sanam?
Yes, I do think that there are some differences that are important to highlight. I think primarily these protests are different because the Islamic Republic is facing multiple simultaneous threats. They're facing internal economic challenges that have been mounting for most of the year, from the currency collapsing, from high inflation, from the impact of sanctions, from corruption across the system. But, in tandem to that, these have become acutely political because the governance structure, the leadership have refused to take the necessary steps to address those economic grievances. And the means to do so is through negotiation with the United States to remove sanctions. So, going back, what has changed is that the Islamic Republic is facing simultaneous internal and external threats, and they haven't faced such threats really since the first decade of the Islamic Republic from 1979 to 1989, where they went through a revolution, consolidated power internally, and faced a war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So I think that's a primary shift. But of course, internally, Iran has seen protests now for many decades. These protests have become stronger. They've spread wider with each round going back to 2009. They have also brought out different constituencies. And, we believe, although we don't have full evidence because the country has been under an internet blackout and communications blackout since January 8th, that these protests have brought out wider cleavages across Iran's society as well. So, these dynamics are important to understand.
Mm.
There's more that we can get into, but let me hand the floor back to you.
Okay, let me ask you this now then, Sanam. President Trump had urged protesters to keep protesting, take over your institutions, and he said, and I'm quoting him here, help is on its way. There are those who argue he is playing a pressure game on the regime, but others say that's just empty rhetoric. So I'm wondering what you make of Trump's handling of the situation thus far.
Well, I think that Trump's symbolic support for the protest movement, alongside that of Reza Pahlavi, Iran's most popular opposition leader, who is the son of the former Shah, played an important role in encouraging people onto the streets and perhaps giving them greater confidence that quote unquote help was on the way. When that help didn't emerge or develop, I think obviously Iranians bore that price and will bear that price further. They have been killed, massacred, if you will. But at the same time, I think that there is perhaps a discussion underway about how much the West can really help them. President Trump, I think, has his eyes set on the Islamic Republic of Iran. He walked back from strikes last week on Wednesday, the 13th and 14th of January. And I think that's because the US did not have an adequate military readiness in the Middle East. And since then, it has been moving an aircraft carrier to the region. There was an assumption that Iran would respond to any US strike on its territory, and of course, deep concerns across the region that this would become much more of a regional conflict. And so the US is moving in to be ready should there be another trigger or another opportunity to pressure Iran. What I think Trump is seeking is what I've written about. It is seeking the strategic submission of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Trump ultimately wants to change the hostile and adversarial relationship between the US and Iran. He wants to be the one that accomplishes that. He's helped bury Iran's nuclear program through US strikes on Iran in June of 2025, but he hasn't yet obtained a deal from the establishment in Tehran. And so he is looking for further compromise or concession or surrender on Iran's ballistic missile program, commitments from Iran to stop arming the so-called axis of resistance in the region. And that could come through further military conflict or could come over the heads of the Iranian people through a deal. So I think those scenarios are still very much on the table.
Just to go back to Raza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, what sort of support does he have? Because his father was a ruthless and brutal dictator in his own right.
Well, look, I think it's important to see things for as they are. Reza Pahlavi has become an important symbolic figure that was able to draw out a number of crowds to the Iranian street over the past few weeks. He called them to come, and many people did come, and they did chant his name over those days. Do I take that to mean that Iranians are looking to restore the monarchy or looking to him to be the so-called transition leader, should there be a revolution or a change in the regime? Not necessarily. I think that right now, Iranians are deeply committed to overthrowing the Islamic Republic. And so there's consensus on what they don't want. What I'm not quite yet seeing is what they do want. And so it's easy to latch on or respond to calls from abroad out of desperation in the context of what's taking place inside the country, but it doesn't necessarily translate. And externally, Reza Pahlavi didn't receive the support of the US president, for example. There was no meeting that was set up. The president expressed I think very clearly that he thought he was a nice guy, but also intimated that he might not be the right person in this moment to deliver, what I think Trump is pushing for, which is a deal and the economic opening of Iran, so that he can be part of the commercial opportunities and help make Iran great again.
Yes, help make Iran great again. Um, the Gulf states, and in particular Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who have made it very clear they will not allow use of their airspace. And in the case of Qatar of Al Udeid Air Base, they do not want to see military strikes, military action. How persuasive have they been in deterring any U.S. or, for that matter, Israeli direct strikes on the regime at this time?
Well, I think the Gulf states, and obviously there are divisions among them, but particularly in this case, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman have played an important role in trying to bring down the temperature. Each communicated to the president that they were opposed to strikes and worried, I think, quite openly that they would be dragged in, particularly since the United States wasn't actively engaging in a regime change operation, but perhaps was only planning on surgically striking elements of the Iranian regime. So I think in this scenario, they've been quite direct, but it's unclear over a longer period of time how influential they will be in preventing further conflict or helping to facilitate a backroom deal with the Islamic Republic as well. I think they're quite caught and still, quite dependent on the Trump administration for security, but simultaneously seeking more strategic autonomy. So it is an awkward moment. And the collapse of the Islamic Republic or further war in the region are outcomes that, most states in the Middle East are uncomfortable with.
Interesting. Yeah. Israel is not uncomfortable with it, though, because they've been pushing the U.S. hard and to do something major, bigly, as Trump would have it. How do you think the White House will be weighing up Israel's arguments that now is the time to take out the Ayatollah, or has that moment passed?
I mean, certainly it's worthwhile remembering that Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Mar-a-Lago on December 28th and 29th, talking to President Trump, and Iran was without a doubt on the agenda. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu sees an opportunity and maybe has been trying to lobby the United States to take more of an overt role in weakening the bolts on the Islamic Republic so that changes or further weakness can materialize. It's interesting that through the protests, actually, the Prime Minister's office tried to provide symbolic support and supported the aims of the protesters, but was quite quiet on statements or analysis about the imminent downfall of the Islamic Republic simultaneously. And I think they sought to let this play out by Iranians, although, of course, behind the scenes on social media, they have been quite influential in supporting narratives and political leaders that would like to see a changed Iran. But that doesn't take the doesn't remove the prospect of renewed Israeli-Iran confrontation. It certainly could happen in the coming weeks or months in this year. Certainly, it's an election year in Israel, so there's not a huge amount of maneuver. But if the Islamic Republic does continue to showcase that it has cracked down on the protests and has survived yet another round, that's where Israel could take proactive measures against Iran's ballistic missile facilities, for example.
Proactive meaning strikes, airstrikes.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa program at London's Chatham House. For more on what Arab Digest has to offer, head to our website, arabdigest.org, where you can find details on how to receive our daily newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. I'm thinking about Iraq as well. So Iraq must be feeling a little anxious, to put it mildly. But how is Baghdad managing the situation?
Well, I think right now the Iraqi government is very focused on government formation, and that sort of bartering process is well underway as to who will be the next prime minister. And I think that's the number one priority. They're very much trying to insulate themselves from the chaos in Iran, from regional tensions. They are being quite careful to avoid engaging with the Israelis. They are the one component of the axis of resistance. None of the groups inside Iraq have been struck. And perhaps Iraqis do see an opportunity in this moment of Iranian weakness to prioritize diversifying from Iran, also strengthening relations with the Trump administration, not just from a security perspective, but a commercial one. So I think they're being quite careful. And from Iran's perspective, a stable, politically and economically stable Iraq is also very important. As the Islamic Republic is squeezed and more sanctioned going forward, it will become even more dependent on its neighbors. And so the stability and those networks and relationships will be important going forward.
Okay. I want to ask you now, Sanam, about just how big a threat Iran remains, because the axis of resistance deeply degraded, the economy is collapsing around the regime's ears. So, is Iran still the threat it was, I don't know, let's say even 2 years ago?
It is certainly much less of a threat than it has ever been since Iran expanded and embedded its power and networks across the region. But I wouldn't say the threat has been completely eliminated. This is a sinking ship, if you will, as you've described it, and one without too many off-ramps. But the cards that they hold and the cards that they could play, could have a devastating impact regionally as well as in Iran. I mean, they still maintain repressive capacity that they haven't been afraid to use against their own citizens across the region. Obviously, among the axis of resistance groups, the Houthis remain the most resilient. And, it's not as if they can just press a button and reactivate conflict. That would come at a cost, but there is still destabilizing capacity there. Beyond that, Iran has always threatened to close the Straits of Hormuz or attack Gulf infrastructure or U.S. installations across the region. So those capabilities remain. It's unclear if they would be proactive and offensive in that way without provocation, but that's still there. But in short, yes, I would say that the Islamic Republic has been severely weakened, and perceptions that the Islamic Republic have been weakened have been proven over the past 2 years, not just by Israeli strikes against the Iran-backed groups, but by Israelis infiltrating Iran and taking out senior IRGC officials and scientists. And the perception that the Islamic Republic was invincible and 10 feet tall has definitely been broken.
Yeah, yeah, cut down to size, certainly by the Israelis in particular. But you spoke earlier about Trump wanting strategic submission. How does that work? Because the Iranians are very proud people. The last thing that they would want to give, even if they hate this regime, to give someone like Donald Trump strategic submission.
Well, I think we have to separate the Iranians. There are the Iranian people, and then there's the regime. And this is a regime that definitely sees this as an existential moment. Their language, their narrative of the protests and protesters being, orchestrated from abroad, funded from abroad, managed from abroad, including terrorist elements to it, such as ISIS, really speak to how they are seeing things, or at least how they're trying to sell things. Shutting down the internet and closing off the country is another indication of that as well. But, could this system come to an arrangement with President Trump? I don't think quickly, but there are pragmatic elements that have long been lobbying for a deal. And in the interest of self-preservation, that is, I think, a scenario that one could imagine. I say that, of course, also thinking that Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, who has been in power since 1989, remains stubborn and uncompromising. It sees the United States as a country that has been trying to overthrow or overturn the Islamic Republic for 47 years. So, he hasn't ever shown his willingness to reform. And at the end of the day, he has led this regime in pursuing hostile policies towards the West, but also in murdering its own people. So, in the same time that I say this, I can't necessarily imagine Khamenei himself making those compromises. I do think that this system, for the time being, is going to lumber along, but the road ahead is going to be hard. This is a system that is going to be relying more on repression rather than any sort of legitimacy from within. And over time, whether it's because of war and external consequences, or because there have been changes from within because of Khamenei's death or alternate political developments, we will see this system transform. We just don't know how it is going to transform. Is it going to transform along the lines of Egypt? Is it going to transform along the lines of um, Poland, for example, or Russia? There are many models out there that we could see be applied to Iran. I think that the regime is looking around at the examples of history, though. Particularly, let's just play them out from the Middle East. You have protests in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and you saw military intervention at the tail end of it against an elected government. We've got the Syria scenario of war, and then, of course, the fleeing of Bashar al-Assad. You have the Libya scenario where Muammar Gaddafi, made concessions with the West, and at the end, he was killed by his own people. So these are not great outcomes for this system. I think probably people know, even within the system, that the regime is slowly dying. They're just trying to manage its death in their own interests and in the interest of what comes next.
Yeah, and I suppose the question is, because Ali Khamenei is an old man and not in the best of health, but if we set aside military action, how does this theocratic regime, which has done such terrible things to the Iranian people over so many decades now, and has been a major regional threat, how does this theocratic regime, get knocked into the dustbin of history? Is it just going to, as you said, lumber along, or is there some sort of mechanism? And as I said, put aside the military one, because the Middle East doesn't want a military one aside from the Israelis. Donald Trump, I think, would prefer a non-military solution. So, what is the path forward now, do you think, Sanam?
I mean, I think lumbering along while it looks for opportunities to re-legitimize its conversations with the United States, if possible, to avoid war with Israel or the United States at the same time. I think that's how it's going to lumber along. It will be much more internally focused. It will need to continue to repress its population to prevent further protests that are endemic and part of this protest struggle that has been ongoing for quite some time. And eventually, if none of these strategies can save the Islamic Republic, hopefully the Iranian people will be able to save themselves and help to be part of a successful protest movement. But that would require agency as well, better coordination, better leadership, putting aside sort of ideological or personal differences and trying to build resilience from the inside and working collaboratively in a way that we haven't seen. And of course, facing a repressive state, that is an outcome that's equally hard to imagine. There are many activists and there are many civil society workers and political leaders inside the country that have ideas that are thinking about a different future. But again, they're facing prison, they're languishing in prison, and it's very hard to mobilize when the state is organized and maintains a consolidated capacity and ability to respond in such a brutal way.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, a watching brief there. But in the meantime, thanks so much, Sanam, for talking with us today.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me, Bill.
My guest today on the Arab Digest podcast was Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa program at London's Chatham House. Arab Digest is an independent voice on the Middle East and North Africa. No sponsors, no advertising. With all that is going on in the world and the huge challenges independent media is facing as the US and other democracies tilt towards authoritarianism, we need your help. We need your support. Head to the website arabdigest.org and look out for the offer of a free 2-month trial to our reader-supported daily newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest. Essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.